Hello and welcome to the Hunter Bond podcast, where I get the opportunity to speak to the leaders and key players within technology, financial services, and the recruitment industry. Very pleased today to be joined by Paul Jacobs. For anyone who doesn't know Paul, Paul has a wealth of experience within the recruitment industry, near enough or maybe exceeding 40 years. Been the managing director of Office Angels, COO of Hudson, and is of late the co-founder and director of Jump Advisory Group. So Jump Advisory Group, they advise and support the world leaders in recruitment, helping them with their growth ambitions and day-to-day practices. So thank you for joining me today, Paul. Firstly, how are you doing? How are you?
I'm very well indeed, thanks, Matt. It's nice to speak to you, and thank you for inviting me. It's much appreciated.
That's all right. That's all right. There's a lot to talk about today. I think, how the world and not just the recruitment industry has changed dramatically, I think, in the past 12 months, but it's
Yeah.
interesting to understand them changes and possibly what the outcome is going to be
Hmm.
moving forwards. But firstly, I was, going back to the beginning, for someone like myself who wasn't around maybe in the 70s and 80s of recruitment,
Be
very
careful what you
interested.
say here, Matt.
Yeah, I'm delicate. I'm being delicate of all words, but very interested to know, I guess, what recruitment was like back then and how you've seen recruitment naturally change over the last few decades.
Oh my gosh. So, yeah, no, I've been in recruitment for, I think this year is 45 years, which is just crazy. I mean, it's just crazy.
Time flies when you're having
It
fun.
really does. And I really don't know where the years have disappeared to. So I started in 1976 for a company called the Alfred Marks Bureau, which in its day was the largest and best known recruitment business in the UK. They had over 200 offices, I think, around the UK, a bit like coffee shops are today. You know, there was one on every street
Right.
corner. If you were a job seeker in your lunch hour, you wandered into a local employment agency. And so I was at the Alfred Marks Bureau, and I joined when I was 19, completely by accident. I wandered in looking for a job, and I was working for an insurance broker, CT Bowring. I was a Lloyd's of London insurance broker as a kid, and I just walked into this local agency, and before I knew it, they'd offered me a job to start working there on the grand sum of £40 a week, and all the coffee I could drink and all the cigarettes I could smoke, as I recall.
Okay.
And of course, it was a as we would call it in those days, a secretarial agency.
Right.
Um, and I think it's funny to think back now that the height of technology was to ask a secretary if she, and it was women that were typists and secretaries, very few men in those days. In fact, the only guys that you'd meet that were typists were ex-forces very often. So you would ask the secretary, could you use an electric or a manual typewriter? And most of them were still using the old manual typewriters with the carriages where you'd
Clank,
tap
clank,
along and
clang.
then
Yeah.
bang bang. And so we went from electric typewriters to then golf ball typewriters, no carriage, just a little ball that whirled around. And then that became a memory typewriter, which would memorize 2 or 3 paragraphs of typing, which ultimately then became word processors. And of course, there was an explosion of word processors or manufacturers of word processors. Um, so we had people like Deckmate, which was, I think, IBM, if memory serves me, Wang. There were a whole range of them. And even Amstrad. Amstrad, our friend Mr. Sugar, had quite a lot of computers competing with IBM in those days. So the technology began to take its sort of grip very slowly in my early years in recruitment. But yeah, very different days to the ones we see today. And, I would regularly interview probably 10 candidates a day. So if something in order of 50 candidates a week would sit at my desk, offer them a cup of coffee and a cigarette. And my job was to try and arrange 3 interviews for them whilst they sat next to me before they left the office. Because if they left the office and I hadn't arranged 3 interviews for them, they'd walk down Agency Alley into Reed, into Brook Street, into Kelly, get interviews. And before I knew it, they'd got jobs and I'd missed the opportunity to place them in a job. So you had to work fast. And it wasn't unusual for me to be making 25 to 30 permanent placements a month, which is extraordinary by today's standards. But that was the pace we worked at. And those were the days I grew up in those very early years.
What was it? Was it very high street led then back then? Did you, I guess today, the sort of agency and office, where walk-ins is, especially, I guess it depends on the industry focus that you're within, but walk-ins is probably quite rare in some specialist fields. Was it very high street led, was it?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you walked into a recruitment agency or an employment bureau, as we call them, you were interviewed. You might have to sit for a little while in the reception area, having filled in your application form, because CVs rarely existed. We didn't ask for CVs because they were almost something that didn't exist. People filled in little application forms in reception on a little board, and then they gave you the form, and you'd sit with them and you'd go through their career history off the forms. It was all manual. We didn't have computers. We had 1,000,001 index boxes. I do recall very clearly.
Very
these
paper
little
led, I
index
can imagine.
boxes. Yeah, oh, completely. We had messages that would come around every day distributing the vacancies that the other Alfred Marks branches in London had taken. I can't remember how many branches they would have had, offices they would have had in London, but you're probably in the order of 25 to 30. And so I was getting 3 deliveries a day of all of the jobs from my colleagues elsewhere in London, plus our own. So you'd have these boxes behind you, and if somebody came in looking for a role, you'd start with postcodes. So if you were a typist or a secretary or an administrator or a receptionist or a telephonist, you'd look at these boxes and you'd start with the postcodes EC1, EC2, EC3, W1, W2, and so on and so on. And you'd pull out hundreds of jobs, you flick through them, and you pick up the phone, you dial numbers, and you'd ask to speak to whoever was on the contact on these cards. And you'd say, look, I've got Matt sitting next to me, and this is his experience, this is what he does, and he's looking for a new role, this is his salary. And very often they'd say, well, is he available to come in for an interview now? You say, Matt, can you go now? Yes, Matt can come immediately. Okay, great. And they'd arrange an interview, and off you'd send them. So it was really, really quick. I mean, great for a 19, 20-year-old, adrenaline pumped, great fun, non-stop action. There's lots of interviews going on, great fun helping people. And as I said, typically I'd be making 5 or 6 placements a week. And I think in those early days, I realized, even as a youngster, that I was changing people's lives. I was getting them great jobs, getting them into jobs they were happier in. And it was a great feeling to be able to do that. And very often people would buy a box of chocolates or a bottle of wine or whatever. And it was just a great vibe. And I absolutely, completely loved it. And within no time at all, I was, I felt like I'd found my vocation. It was something that I loved doing and I enjoyed doing. And with all due modesty, I was pretty good at it. We had, as I said, over 200 offices, and I was in their top third by way of being a consultant. And I was their youngest ever branch manager. I think, literally nearly 20. I was 19 when I was made a branch manager in High Holborn.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, where we don't necessarily have the ability to send CVs to represent our candidates as a consultant, that ability to really sell and represent your candidate over the phone or a conversation sounds even more valuable back then as it is today. How has that sort of changed, I guess, in the perspective of maybe a client's relationship with agencies? Do you think there's more of an emphasis now on let's just provide the product, here's the CV, here's what we think of them, or do you think
I think it's just a great question, Matt. And I think what an interesting point, that I think what the pandemic has done in a strange way is allowed recruitment businesses to recalibrate, to consider how they're going to work with clients going forward. And unquestionably, particularly when I was a manager of those offices, from the age of 19 through to 26, something in that order, everything was built upon relationships. I knew my clients extremely well. I'd see some of them, literally physically see them a couple of times a week, and I could literally pick up a telephone and have a conversation with any of them pretty instantly, and they in turn did the same with me. So my business was very much built on personal relationships, my own personal relationships with my clients, and indeed my staff's relationships with them. And that was very much, I felt, grew from consistently seeing them. We were providing temporary staff every week. So each week we would speak to those clients 2-3 times. We were taking regular permanent vacancies from them as well. And the interesting thing I think about the pandemic is that particularly, and we'll talk about this I'm sure later, with the advent of all the new technology and the sheer pace of the technological changes, I think it's going to allow recruitment businesses and recruitment consultants to spend time with their customers, getting to know them to the degree that I knew my clients back in the day. There's an old adage that I'm sure people have heard: people buy people. And that's very true. You buy the name over the door because it gives you comfort that the company you're dealing with have got credibility, that they're a nice business to deal with, you feel comfortable with them. But ultimately, it's the person you're dealing with that makes the difference, that personal contact. And I think that was something I was very keenly aware of when I was a young man. And later on, particularly when I was the managing director, CEO of Office Angels for many years, we very much built our business model on that very same premise, getting to really understand the needs and requirements, specific needs and requirements of our customers, and spending time with them physically, as it were, in their offices, seeing them, and so forth. Of course, now we're using platforms like Zoom, Teams, Skype, and various others. And although we cannot presently physically see people, we're substituting that physical meet with a virtual meet. But I think it means that we're getting back to the days where we could get to know our clients very well as personalities. And they, importantly, can get to see us regularly. And that, I think, fosters, over a period of time, trust.
Yeah.
Because the thing I think that everybody understands very clearly is that it takes a long time to build trust. You don't just get it in the first meeting. It takes a period of time to prove yourself to a client that you can be trusted, you have ethics, you have a good moral compass, that you have their best interests at heart. It takes a long time to do that. And you have to consistently provide evidence and validate that trust is well vested in you. But it also takes a nanosecond to lose it. And once you've lost it, you can't get it back, or it's very, very hard to get it back. So I think it's trust. To earn trust takes a period of time. And when you've got it, you have to nurture it and value it, take care of it. But if you do that, particularly as a recruitment consultant, then you can have, as I did in my day, years and years and years of wonderful relationships with clients who trust you, who come to you with all of their requirements, and are comfortable with just dealing with you.
Yeah.
Is what I had certainly in my early days, and with my old business, Office Angels. Absolutely, we had the most successful recruitment business, pound for pound, in the country, maybe even from an office support perspective globally. Part of the Adecco empire, the world's largest recruitment business, and we were the fifth biggest profit-making unit for the Adecco empire, the global empire, which meant we were punching well above our weight at the time. So we had a wonderful business. It was very much built, though, on this premise that people buy people.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, building relationships and recruitment has always been, one of the, if not the biggest important thing. But what you're saying, especially about building them long-term relationships and sustainable relationships where you're providing a quality long-term service to existing clients, I think has really become even more evident with this current pandemic. I think a lot of industries have struggled, especially maybe the agencies that are a bit more very contingency based on jumping from one client to client, providing a service here, moving on to the next client. I'm finding, speaking to a lot of the recruitment industry quite often, that the businesses which are succeeding a lot more are the ones who have these very strong long-term relationships with clients, who provide them an abundance of roles, who consistently do placements with these companies, and have, where especially a lot of companies are maybe looking to reduce their costs in terms of using agency spend. They're being maybe a little bit more selective with the amount of agencies they're working with. A few other things that you mentioned as well, I think, going back to I guess the ability for us now to, I say ability, meeting clients has always been, again, a very important part of the recruitment industry, but where everyone now, I guess, is a little bit more comfortable and familiar with the idea of using Zoom or Microsoft Teams to interact with our clients, or interact with anyone really within their businesses. I think we've definitely got a better opportunity here to be able to, I guess, leverage off of this and actually use this as a good tool to. It saves the consultants time traveling to sites and whatnot. I think absolutely. I think clients are going to be more comfortable with the idea of booking in regular Zoom meetings and conversations to help nurture that. So I think definitely people should be trying to take advantage of this, I guess, this new approach or new view towards using this sort of technology platform to do these meetings.
And I totally agree, Matt. And I think that we, as an industry, have kind of, in a sense, lost our way a little bit, in my opinion, over the last 10 years or so, because we've become a business that's purely about an industry that's purely about sending CVs. Now, for me,
About the
if you look
product
at
rather than
and that's
the
not what we
relationship.
should
Yeah.
be about,
No, I
If
agree.
you look at the phrase consultant, look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It talks about an expert. It talks about a teacher. It talks about somebody passing over knowledge. But if all you're doing is sending CVs, that doesn't fit. That doesn't match the statement consultant. What I think the technology now allows us to do now, video platforms and so forth, is spend time with our clients, really understanding their specific needs, and then customizing our provision of services to enable them to get exactly what they want. And I think that what the pandemic has clearly shown to us is that it is perfectly okay to use these platforms to conduct business. And most of my clients, so I work, as you're well aware, with quite a number of recruitment businesses, including Hunter Bond. But most of my clients now are using the video platforms as the default to speak to clients and candidates, especially from a candidate perspective, by the way, because here we have a chance to really spend time talking to candidates, getting to see them, to understand them. There's so much more you can learn when you have a physical interview. So, you can see body language. If you ask a difficult question, you ask a competency-based question, and you observe the body language of the person you're speaking to, that often betrays the truth. It tells you whether they're being honest with you or not. And I think what we're enabling our consultants to do by using these platforms is really understand the candidates they're working with and who they are, and enables us to become, I think, more selective, more careful with our choices. And equally, when we speak to clients, really understand their moods, what they're seeking. And again, to some extent, that's to do with being able to see somebody, facial movements, body language. Because without that, you're resigned to using just the telephone, and all you can use then essentially is one of your five senses, which is your hearing. Whereas here, as we're talking now, I'm using several of my normal senses, and that obviously enhances the experience for everybody.
I think especially if you're a recruitment consultant that works within a very specialist market. So Hunter Bond, we're FinTechnology focused, and as recruitment consultants, I've been in technology for nearly enough 7 years. I couldn't write a single line of code. We have a good understanding of technology. We can have conversations. We do know some detailed qualification questions and answers that we can ask our candidates. But a lot of it, as a recruitment consultant, to qualify a candidate and understand, or at least try and gauge the confidence in their answer or certain abilities, is using your emotional intelligence. And as you say, over the telephone, you get a gauge, but I think face-to-face interaction, when actually trying to qualify your candidates to make sure they are suitable for your clients, which is really just as important as just finding someone to send a CV. I think using Zoom and there's a lot of other really useful new technology products that are coming out as well. Which you actually have the ability to record these interviews and send these interviews along with CVs, which I think is also a good tool that I think a lot of companies are using
absolutely
now.
And I think one of the things we know from history, when you look at global crises, so if you look at world wars, for example, one of the things coming out of the Second World War that became a boom industry, something we take for granted now, is aviation. So a lot of the technology that was then used to develop jet aircraft, for example, came off the back of the technological advances made during the war for warplanes and missiles and things. We've seen also, coming away from the space era, a lot of the technology used then we've used subsequently. And of course, we know with car manufacturing, a lot of the technology that they use to manufacture modern cars comes off of F1 and so forth. What we're going to see, I think, coming out of this crisis is a real acceleration in the development of technology. If you've considered purely the point about the virus, for example, when you consider how quickly the medical fraternity have managed to get out there and develop a vaccine. I mean, it's extraordinary. In the space of less than a year, we've got a large number of vaccines now that have been developed and will no doubt be finessed. If prior to that, you're talking 10, 15 years to develop vaccines.
Yeah.
And I think that analogy is true of what's going to happen as we now move out of this pandemic. We're going to see technology really ramping up very quickly moving forward. And what happens, as we know with technology, is that it becomes cheaper to use and more sophisticated.
Yeah.
So I think exciting times, not just obviously for the employment industry, the recruitment industry, but also, of course, just about every aspect of our personal lives.
Yeah. Anytime there's a shift, I guess, in how we operate in this world, or when there's a demand for a new tool or system, technology is the first one to innovate. And where there's always a need, there's always going to be some form of supply. And yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. For whether it be the recruitment industry or our clients or even candidates, in terms of what the tools and resources they're going to have to help them and us in terms of our search and being able to connect with people. I think one thing you sort of touched on before as well, I think, was about building relationships and I guess having, as a consultant, having more of a face. But I think something that's really important, I think consultants should be considering a lot more, is also personal branding, in terms of not just necessarily how do I sustain relationships, but how do I also attract and work with new clients? How do you advise, and how do you see, I guess, the personal branding of a recruitment consultant or business moving forwards, and what can people do to improve that?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. I think, we talked about this, or you talked about it a moment ago, emotional intelligence, EQ, as they now call it. And I think that people that work in our industry who have sustained relationships with clients and build those trusted advisor positions have very high emotional intelligence. And what I mean by that is they're perceptive, they are sensitive, they are empathetic, they're active listeners, so they can hear not just what people are saying to them, but they're aware of the tone of voice, the speech pattern. They're often, almost always, start to finishers. They're likable personalities. They're people who engender trust because they demonstrate that high level of emotional intelligence. And I think that's always been the case with people that have done well in our industry, have managed to develop long-term relationships with candidates and clients. Emotional intelligence is extremely important. And of course, it's one of those things that you cannot study. You can't get a degree in EQ. It doesn't exist. Either you have it or you haven't got it. And it's definitely something that's very different from IQ, academic ability, the ability to take in information, which is extremely important, of course, but it's a different set of attributes. If you're dealing with a consultant as a client who has high IQ and high EQ, it's brilliant, it's wonderful. But I think that to answer your question, the issue here is very much about this ability to sell what I always term the U brand. So I mentioned earlier that working for a great business like Hunter Bond gives you great credibility because clients are aware of the business, are happy and very delighted with the service that they receive from Hunter Bond. But they will also seek to develop, whether they're conscious or subconsciously, whether they're conscious of it or not, they will look to develop relationships with the individual that works for that business. And that will often be governed by that individual's ability to sell themselves as a trusted advisor. That again comes down to this point about high emotional intelligence. Getting to understand your client, putting your client first. We used to use the expression customer is king or the customer is queen. And I think that it's still extremely important. For me, when I advise businesses, I always say the same thing. Place your candidates and clients slap bang in the middle of your decision making. What is right for them? What is it they want from you as an individual and as a business? And then you work flat out to provide them with exactly what they want, regardless of any inconvenience that may cause you. It's about providing them with the service they want, and that's customized as well. And I think that if people are prepared to do that as recruitment consultants and sell themselves in that sense, really caring. And by the way, to be a great recruitment consultant, you have to be authentic. You can't fake it. You can't fake being interested about your client.
You can smell it a mile off, can't you, Jim?
Always. You have to be passionate about what you do. And if you believe in your clients and you believe in your candidates, it's passionate. It sort of oozes out of every pore of your being then people buy that. They buy that authenticity because they can, as you say, they can sense it. It's very real. And when you've got that level of enthusiasm and passion for what you do, then people buy into you. As I say, you can't fake that. It's not possible to do that. And you have to really genuinely care about the people you work with, your clients and your candidates. And when you do that, then you're selling your own brand. You're, in a sense, people buy into you as a human being. Again, as I said earlier, you can't fake that. It's not something you can learn at school or college or university. It's either something you have in your DNA or you haven't got it.
Yeah. So you can be passionate, and I think you can have emotional intelligence, but I think what I sometimes see is people not, maybe showing that in the best possible way, really getting their passion out there and what they're interested in. How should people do that? Should they be taking advantage of, the social networking tools, or what could they do, I guess, to get that passion out there to the market?
Well, I think, it comes back to a number of things. So, for example, I've mentioned this already. I think using this kind of platform so people can see you, they can see you're animated about what you're doing. That makes a difference. High levels of energy are very important. So, I wrote an article last week about this very point about giving out positive energy, because I think when you do that, then you get positive energy back. If you come into work and you're miserable and your energy level is low and you look and sound miserable, then you cannot expect people to be excited when they engage with you. But if you give out positive energy and you kind of radiate that level of enthusiasm and passion, it comes in your voice, it's in the tone of your voice. If they can see you, it's in your physicality. Then I think people buy into that quite very, very much. I think the other point, of course, is that you've got to know your stuff. If you're going to call yourself a consultant, then you need to be an expert in what you do. You need to know your candidates inside out, backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
You need to understand your clients, the employers, who they are, what they do. Not just a quick look at the website, but really understand.
Take a real interest.
A
Do
real
your
interest
research,
in what
know
they're
your
doing.
stuff.
Absolutely. And in the people you're working with within that business, know them. Because I think, we know, for example, in our industry, it's not just about matching skill sets with a job description. That's part of what we do, of course, and we try to do that very accurately. But I would argue very strongly that cultural fit, behaviors and values matched against the behaviors and values of an employer are even more important
Yeah.
than the actual skill set match, or at least as important. So, I've always told people, and they always laugh when I say this, but it's true. In a sense, we're in the dating business, because
Right.
you can match somebody's skill set pretty accurately to the description that you have of a job, of a role. And you can get pretty close with that using good quality intelligence, IQ, and common sense. Okay. But what you can't do easily is match cultural
Yeah.
alignment. And I think it's really important to understand the differences with your customers, as it were, as a consultant, your clients, who they are, what they do, the personality of the business, the behaviors and values of the business. And you have to look at your candidates and try and understand whether those people match culturally the behaviors and values of the customer. If you can do that, then you've got a match. And if you fail to do that, then you can find that your candidates and the client's needs are matched, but they just don't get
Yeah.
along. It's that dating thing. They go on the first date, the interview, but they don't want a second date. So having that level of cultural alignment becomes extremely important. And the only way you can figure that out is spending time with your clients and spending time with the candidates. So it takes time, and you have to ask the right questions in order to understand it. Now, often from our point of view as a recruitment business, the more we work with our clients, the more we get to know them, the easier it becomes, I think, then to look at a candidate and think, yep, you're right for these guys. I think you'll be perfect together, and you'd be pretty accurate with that assessment, or absolutely not, you're not right, and you won't like working there either, even when the actual skill sets match up. So I think it's actually always in the interest of employers, clients, to work closely with people they trust within a recruitment business. And over a period of time, that knowledge base, that level of understanding of what works for that client in terms of the match of candidates becomes more and more acute, and the matchmaking becomes tighter and tighter.
I think that's the same, but on the candidate side of things, I think we, sometimes as consultants, very focused maybe on the salary and the job title or the role as being the main drive of what a candidate is looking for. But really, if you look into, or if you really get to understand candidates' drives and bias and reasons they accept jobs, a lot of the times it's for the culture, or there's a lot of factors that's outside of the salary or what the job description is advertising that is going to be the main sell. And I think it's really not only getting to understand your clients and what their key sells are and the cultures, and sure that we're making a good match there, but also what is the main drives of the candidate. And that comes down to again, not only qualifying them on a job description, but really getting to understand your candidates and what their motivations are.
Completely agree with you. Absolutely right. 100% correct. Yeah.
Touching back on, I think what we was speaking about initially, I think when we was talking about, you was also a branch manager at a very young age. So you've obviously had a wealth of experience in management at different levels. How have you as a leader seen, I guess, the recruitment industry change in terms of how you've had to manage staff? How have you had to adapt, I guess, your management techniques? And do you see, I guess, a big change in the sort of generational approach to being management? I think recruitment, maybe had a bit of a stigma. Obviously, a few decades ago, of being very, very sales orientated. I think target driven in a way. Have you seen a big shift in terms of how businesses and how managers are having to actually encourage and get the best out of their staff?
Massive changes. I mean, when I started work in the 70s, 80s, employment law was very light touch. It wasn't what it is today. And
Go away with a bit more.
And if your face didn't fit and your boss didn't like you, you could be dismissed pretty easily.
Okay.
Employment tribunals and all the issues that we're now aware of didn't exist in any, particularly. And I think we were quite vulnerable as employees. We were quite vulnerable, and it wasn't unusual for people to feel bullied by bosses. You'd hear those stories all day long. I would interview candidates, as I mentioned earlier, all day long, and I very regularly heard stories about people feeling bullied, intimidated, treated badly by their employers. It was kind of normal.
Yeah, was that just the way it was? So people just got on with it, or is it still very much people?
I don't think they got on with it, Matt. I think what happened was they changed jobs regularly, and of course, in those days, you could change jobs quite easily. People would come in, and they'd been on a week's notice. They'd come in and say to me, I don't like my boss. I don't like the company. I want to change. And I'd get them interviews. And, within a week, they'd got a new job offer. They'd resigned and they'd started a new job. I mean, that's what happened. People weren't frightened of changing jobs. But so in certain organizations, their attrition rates were horrendous, absolutely horrendous. I think what we've seen, thankfully, over the years has been an improvement in the legislation around employee rights. People are now much more acutely aware of their rights within an organization. And I think hopefully we've seen huge improvements in the need for bosses to recognize that in order to get the best from their people, they have to develop what we now call an EVP, an employer value proposition. And when you look at the best examples of EVP with organizations globally, you'll find consistently that employees are provided with a level of ownership over tasks. They're empowered. Communication's very heightened. They're constantly spoken to. Their views are sought by the bosses, by the owners, by the leaders. They're listened to. They feel very much a part of the organization. They're not kept in the dark. They're very much, the communication is very transparent. I think people are enabled in that sense. And I think that when you look at the very best businesses globally, if you take the obvious examples of Apple or various other well-known organizations, you'll find that people feel very integrated in their businesses. They feel part of the company's fabric. They're very much constantly spoken to about what's going on. Everything is visible to them. They're encouraged to take on more and more responsibilities and so forth. We're working, thankfully, in much more enlightened days. Also, of course, although there's a huge amount of work still to do, as we're well aware, people are now much more aware of diversity and inclusion. Back in my early days in the 70s and 80s, I would say without a shadow of doubt that racism was very much in evidence in organizations. I won't go into lots of detail in this particular podcast, but I was very aware of discrimination in the workplace. I think we all were. Those things were very evident in the 70s in the culture of this country, and globally, I think. Thankfully, we're more enlightened now. There's still, as I said, huge amount of work to do, but we're getting better. I think it's also true to say that sexism was very, very evident in my early years in the industry. I mentioned at the very top of this discussion that secretaries were almost exclusively female, um, as was the opposite was the case with bosses. You very rarely found female bosses, female leaders. It wasn't something you came across very often.
Was recruitment very male dominated, or?
Well, one of the beautiful things about our industry, Matt, and I'll say this very proudly, is that our industry has always been a meritocracy. If you're good enough,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
then
Age
fine. Age, gendered makes no part. And I had female bosses when I was a kid in the industry. Obviously, I was CEO of Office Angels for many years, predominantly a female industry, a female business. I'm very proud of that fact that our industry has never, in any respect, in my experience, of nearly 45 years, ever practiced any form of sexism or gender discrimination or religious discrimination. We've never done that, not that I'm
Yeah.
aware of as an industry. I think we've always been incredible in that sense. But, certainly there's no doubt about it that in 70s Britain, 80s Britain, those things were very clear to us as recruitment consultants. I regularly came across it. Thankfully now, it's very rare, thank God. And although I still believe we've got a long way to go in terms of gender equality, and clearly, I mean, we're all aware of the racism issues over the last 12 months. There's still a lot of work to do there. It's certainly improving, although we must never ever take our eye off of this. We're a way off being where society needs us to be, but it's getting better. So I think that I've seen a lot of changes, but we're still in the need to be very conscious of those changes, the ones that still need to be developed, and people need to be enlightened. But back to EVP, I think that leaders now, particularly, have been managing staff virtually for nearly a year. And I think that requires a great deal of skill set. So, we have to look at enhanced communication. If people are at home, I think it's incumbent upon their bosses, their leaders, to be speaking to them several times during the daytime and not just on the phone via video. If people are still in a situation where they're furloughed, then they are still employees of that business and they need to be communicated with and seen regularly. And I think it talks to improved or improving levels of communication skill sets. It's always been the case that the very best managers and leaders are brilliant communicators. We know through history that can be a good thing and an evil thing. You can pick examples of great communicators who were evil leaders, and you can think of great communicators who are outstanding leaders. But communication is the key point here. And great leaders need to have enhanced communication skills. And great businesses have that level of very clear and transparent communication around it. People want to work in those situations. We often talk about generation X, Y, and Z. I think a lot of bunkum is said about that. I'm 64 nearly, and when I look at what so-called millennials seek in their workplace environment, I seek the same. I'm no different. I want to work in an open environment. I want to be spoken to. I want to be listened to. Why am I different in my 60s to somebody in their 20s? I'm not. I'm the same.
So it's not based on, you don't think it's generational, but it's just the world evolving in general. And I think everybody has, evolving with the times, has the same wants the same sort of rights and kind of working environment, whether they be 20 or 60, I guess.
And absolutely. And I think the warning to companies that fail to heed this need to have open communication and consistently communicate with people for a variety of channels, not just video channels, but good old-fashioned, written channels, emails, letters. Please God, very soon we can actually meet each other again in the not too distant future. All of those things need to be embedded in an organization. And embedded in terms of things like, in terms of performance reviews and those sort of things. I think appraisals, those kind of things. People want to know, how am I doing? Where do I need to improve? Then there's been a big emphasis on improving investment in leadership, in learning and development as well, of course. So I think All of those things become extremely important to people as they develop their careers. Sorry.
No, yeah. So it's something interesting I wanted to touch on was that I mean, you mentioned about people, potentially being on furlough and keeping regular communication. I know the past 12 months or so, Hunter Bond, we went remote working
Yeah.
from the beginning of March and have been for the past year or so, and keeping that communication line open and ensuring that our employees and colleagues are actually in a good mental state as well. I think there are lots of people who are well, they live alone or they're not necessarily having the opportunity to be very social. I guess, being an employer and being a leader, what responsibilities do they have to ensure that their employees are safe and I guess, mentally well in this during period of time?
Yeah, Matt. I mean, I think you picked on a very important subject, mental well-being. I speak to a lot of different organizations every week and every month, and I've lost count of the amount of times that we've discussed somebody's mental well-being. That they're perhaps struggling, particularly the points you've made about living on their own and so forth. It's very, very, very hard for people. It's been extremely challenging for people over the last 12 months. Some people are very fortunate, they live in lovely homes, they've got family around them or partners and friends and so forth, and other people live on their own. But I think that most people have found this a very difficult 12 months in one shape or form. The things that we all took for granted, the simple pleasures of going to a restaurant or a bar or a pub or
What I
grabbing a
do for
cup of
that right
coffee.
now. Yeah.
Absolutely, and going into work and socializing with our colleagues is very important. I remember years ago, and as I said, I've been in the industry a long time, when emailing first came in, and the internet became something that was growing and growing. And bear in mind, the internet, we think of it as being here forever. It really isn't that. It really isn't the case. I don't know how many years, I can't recall, but let's say call it 25, 30 years. It's not very long in real terms.
Mm.
And when we started to see the advent of the new tech era, I remember doing some radio and TV interviews where people were asking me, do you think that we've seen the back of offices, that people will just be working from home in the future, full stop? And I said then, and I'll say it now, that I didn't think that would be the case, because I think we underestimate how important it is for us as human beings to have social interaction, to see other people, to be with other people, to have a laugh with them, to talk about what we had for dinner last night, what we watched on the TV, what we did over the weekend, where we went yesterday evening. All those things that we think are fairly trivial chit chat are actually very good for our mental well-being.
Mm.
We are social beings. Human beings love being with other people. And when that's cut off from us, when we don't have the opportunity to spend time with people, with our colleagues, it takes its toll. So I think that, managing people, leading people at a distance, to your point, being aware of their mental well-being is extremely important. I start every conversation off with, how are you doing at the moment? How are you? How are you feeling? Those kind of comments are things that I say consistently. And I don't say it to be flip. I say it because I'm genuinely interested in how people are feeling. And sometimes when you ask those questions, the response you get is kind of worrying, a bit concerning.
Mm.
Again, if you can see people, you can often see the stress. Now, fortunately, I mean, please God, where are we now? Middle of February 2021. Within a very brief period of time now, the vaccines are now beginning to move forward, up to about 15 million, I think, now. It's very hopeful that by the time we get to spring, we'll be seeing the most vulnerable people in our society vaccinated, more elderly, people with underlying health conditions, and frontline workers, taking massive strain away from the national health. I think at that stage, it's entirely possible that companies will start being able to go back to work at least sometimes in the week. Maybe people won't be working 5 days out of 5 in the office, but we'll see people going in for a couple of days, 2, 3 days out of 5, and working shift systems, because we're still going to have the social distancing issues for some period of time. But I think that will help a lot of people being able to go in 2 or 3 days a week. And I think as leaders, being able to see our people, it makes a big difference, being able to spend time with them. But in the meantime, as a leader, being aware of the mental well-being of our people is extremely important. I've been spending a lot of time recently talking to organizations that work within the mental well-being arena. They've done webcasts with me, and they're working with some of my clients around the country. And I think it's something that as managers, as leaders, we need to be aware of. My final point on this is that we ought to be kind to ourselves as well, because as managers and leaders, we have not only the responsibility of looking after our people, but we also need to check out that we're okay. Being kind to ourselves and being aware of our own mental well-being is also very important.
That's brilliant. And so you think just keeping that line of communication open, regularly checking in is really the most that we can kind of do as leaders, is it? Is there anything?
It's not the only thing. I mean, I think that, we're all aware of things, everybody has their, company video nights and beer nights, pub nights
Yeah,
and
we've done
stuff
many
like that.
Hunter Bond quiz nights and bingo nights, which have
I've attended a
been
few,
great.
and I
Yeah.
was only on for a short period of time, but they seem fun. And I think getting
We have the
people,
WhatsApp groups chats as well, and
yeah,
I think the regular, just as much socializing as possible, really, and just keep in touch with each other it's been wonderful.
and I think things like buddy systems and mentoring systems. I do a lot of mentoring, but you don't need a professional mentor necessarily, although they're very useful to have them. Most businesses now are very aware of how important it is to have external mentoring provided. I'm extremely busy. I do a lot of external mentoring, but you can have buddy systems within your organization where you encourage people to be paired off, and people have a buddy, a mentor that they can talk to within the company who's not their boss or necessarily their
It's a
immediate
really good
colleague.
idea. It's a really good
Those
idea.
things I think are important.
Yeah.
We need to talk, we need to listen as human beings, and having somebody you can trust as a mentor is extremely important. I always tell people when I do my mentoring sessions that what they tell me is entirely confidential. Nothing will be repeated, and I can't and I would not break that trust. They can speak to me about anything work related, and very often people talk about what's going on in their personal lives. And I think that opportunity to confide in somebody neutral, somebody that is listening, that has your best interests at heart, is extremely important, and never more so than now whilst we're all working from home.
Oh, brilliant. How do you see? I guess obviously businesses have had to change, during COVID, adapt. I think, not just recruitment, but I know being adaptable is very important for any business and leader. How have businesses changed during this period of time, and how do you see? I mean, you touched on it slightly, with maybe stagnating, or spreading out, people coming in,
Yeah.
spacing out offices. How do you see that? How do you see us emerging, I guess, from this, and what changes have we sort of made during this time?
Well, it's really interesting because there's an awful lot of noise now about how much office space companies are going to need going forward. You know, I think it's quite interesting when you look at, for example, at what's going on in the high street retail. How many companies are now going bust? You walk down your average high street, how many empty units now? It's really quite depressing. The question then is, what's going to happen to those buildings? What will happen to them? Will they be turned into residential areas? Will they
Coffee
become
shops and phone
offices?
case shops. That's all I see these days.
Absolutely. I don't know what the answer is, but I think the same logic applies to offices, because I think companies are going to look very carefully at smart workspaces. Do you need to have a desk for every single person? And I think the answer is probably no. I think we're going to get used to seeing people hot desking. We were already seeing that pre the COVID crisis anyway. And I think a lot of companies are going to now look at this is a chance to cut their costs and look at ultimately leases providing taking smaller offices, because I don't think we're going to see a situation in a lot of organizations where you're going to have 100% staff in at 100% of the time. I mean, it's fair to say that some of the more forward-thinking corporations were already of this mindset pre-COVID. I won't mention which particular very large telecoms business it was, but I went to their head office, and they'd reduced the amount of footprint they had by a substantial amount, because what they said
Very
was,
good point.
they were looking at people who were traveling. They had people out on the road, salespeople who were hardly ever in the office. They were taking into consideration holidays and sickness. And they realized that I can't remember what the exact percentage occupancy was, but it was certainly never 100%. Let's call it 60 or 70%. Any given moment, their building was 30 to 40% empty. People weren't occupying desks. So they took the view they could shrink their office space, which obviously had a major impact on their costs. It reduced their costs considerably. I think if we go forward now, companies will be looking at office space. Do I need this amount of space? And I suspect the answer is no. I think also lots of people will come out of the COVID crisis thinking, I don't want to go in to London or Manchester or Birmingham or wherever 5 days a week. I can work from home 2 or 3 days a week. I can then go in a couple of days a week. Maybe I'll work from home 5 days a week. And I think it gives employers an opportunity now to reduce costs if they choose to do that, if their businesses permit that. But also they can now bring talent into their business remotely. We've now, I think, once and for all, dealt with the issue of can people work from home and be productive? I think the answer is categorically yes, absolutely. Most people have worked extremely productively from home and have quite enjoyed the experience. But I think if you also speak to those same people, they will say, most of them do not, in my experience, having had those conversations, they don't want to continue to work 5 days a week at home. But if they could work 2 or 3 days from home, they'd be pleased to do that. So I think as we come out of this crisis and over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a big shift in the way businesses are set up and treat their staff and look to bring in talent into their business and look at the cost base of their sort of, if you like, physical footprint.
Do you think if companies don't adapt to that, they potentially will lose, employees as well as struggle to attract talent if they're not as flexible with things like remote working?
Yeah, I do. I think absolutely. If we come back to EVP, I think employees are looking for that level of flexibility. And I think, we're also aware of the ecology. One of the wonderful things, because it's not all been bad. Whilst nobody wanted a pandemic, it's pretty awful for obvious reasons. It's hugely tragic. There have been some good things that have come out of it, notably the improvement in the ecology. I think every one of us has been more aware of the cleaner air, bird song in the morning, that kind of stuff. It's lovely. And I think, we need to be very aware of the fact that we don't want to go back, in my opinion, to rush hours to the degree that we saw them in the past, all going to work at the same time, all coming home at the same time. The issue with the roads and the gunk we put into the atmosphere, that's got to stop. We've got to be much more mindful of protecting our planet. We've done so much damage to it. And, that said, the ecology repairs quite quickly. So we've really got to be mindful of that. I think coming out of this situation, which has been awful and deeply tragic, we must make sure that we become mindful of how we treat employees, how employees treat their employees and vice versa, and how we treat the world we live in. And I think, please God, as we come out of this, there'll be some improvements that, we won't go back to the way we were. That would be the biggest tragedy of all, that we take these lessons and we improve our work-life balance and we improve the planet we live on.
I think it's been an experiment we didn't ask for, Hunter Bond, for example, we never really had a remote working culture before this, but it's worked really effectively. Activity performance has been just as strong. One of my roles in the business is also heading up the learning and development. So it's been a big adapt. I've had to adapt, obviously, the ability to move from classroom type training sessions to more Zoom based sessions, which again, we've helped onboard and actually hired 6 people during lockdown. So, which again, have be able to hit the ground running with the technology, the tools, the resources, the support that we're still able to give people. So I think it's an experiment we never intended to do, but it's come out and it's opened not only our eyes, but the founders' eyes to how we actually be able to, and I think a point that you made as well, the ability to hire people, we're based in London, but there's a whole network and pool of talent out there that we can now actually grasp and actually potentially be able to also onboard as well. But touching on the onboarding and interview process and whatnot, how have you seen, I guess, companies adapt the way that they've actually managed the recruitment process or onboarding? Has that been a smooth transition, do you believe, or do you think people have had to adapt?
I think onboarding is particularly difficult at the moment because, Hunter Bond's a good example. And Hunter Bond, there've been a number of brand new people that have been brought in over the last 6 to 9 months. And it's been challenging to train and induct them correctly during those, particularly first 12 to 13 weeks. It's not easy because generally you'd have somebody sitting with you and you'd be able to train them properly.
and the ability to just have someone to quickly turn to for a small question or query. As much as we, as myself as a trainer, I'm sure the team leaders say, even for the smallest query or question, please do reach out. But I know when I was in office, I had a lot more taps on my shoulders than I do get phone calls these days. So it's been as open to the consultants or new starters as possible, but whether they take advantage of that. So that has been a learning curve.
I agree with you completely, Matt. But I think the other thing, of course, is not just the fact that you've not got the same opportunity to train somebody full on. You've also got a situation where culturally they miss out because they're still sitting in their dining room, they're in their bedrooms, in their offices working, and it becomes more difficult to get them immersed in the culture of the business because we're still working remotely. Look, it's not impossible, and my clients, including Hunter Bond, have inducted people, but it takes a tremendous amount of endurance to do that correctly, to do that as best we can. As I say, I think things will get easier because very soon, hopefully, we can all start to see each other again. And once the sanctions get lifted, and let's hope the spring onwards, and therefore inducting people, onboarding people, I think becomes a little bit easier than it has been with the full lockdowns. But I do think it's back to that earlier point that it's much more effective if you can be with people and have them physically in the office. And the other point, of course, is that, and we all remember these things, when you're working in a business, you're starting in a company, just listening to people around you, watching and observing and taking in things almost imperceptibly is part and parcel of that induction onboarding process, which is denied to people if they're sitting at home at the moment. But I think by and large, people have coped quite well, but it will certainly improve as we start to get the sanctions lifted in the not too distant future.
Yeah. So so I guess with the year ahead and the vaccinations being rolled out, hopefully we'll get a bit of a summer. But what's your predictions for 2021 in terms of the recruitment industry and just the general working world? Is it a brighter future ahead, or do you think we've got another tough year ahead of us?
Well, I think let's be realistic. This is my personal opinion. Obviously, my opinion is just as a citizen. I think that we are still in for several months of this kind of lockdown. I think what's going to happen is that we'll get to around Easter and then we'll go to the tier system again. Now, as I say, in my opinion, it's just a layman's opinion, but that's where I think we'll go. As I said earlier, I think the vaccinations will enable the National Health Service to breathe, thankfully, and we'll see less strain on that. And that is a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's a big deal, too, that the more elderly in our society are protected. And people with underlying health issues. I think that takes a terrific strain away. If you then look at the fact that, the under 30s particularly, fortunately, are rarely, impacted by COVID. They can get ill, but they're very rarely seriously ill. Then you're looking at a much smaller number of people that need the vaccinations. And I think that we'll get into an easier place. From an economic perspective, I'm very optimistic. I think we are in for a mini boom. I think that as the sanctions ease and people are vaccinated and the vaccines are finessed and improved, I think as we move towards the back end of this year, and the Bank of England the week before, were predicting a real recovery in the economy from the back end of this year, 2021, and certainly into 2022. And again, I think if you look at history and you look, for example, at the finish of the Great War, into the Spanish flu, which was a massive global pandemic. And then you go into the Roaring 20s. You look at, a big sort of breath of life, if you like, globally. I think we're going to see something similar. I think we both said, God, we can't wait to go out and buy a beer or go out with our friends to a restaurant or whatever. I think everyone's going to feel that way. I think there'll be a big boom in holidays, people going to events, going out, socializing, all the things we've been denied over the last 12 months. And I think the economy is going to breathe very, very, very easily. There's a lot of talk about companies, corporations, particularly, if you like, building up funds that they'll want to invest. There'll be, I think, a flow of money into the economy.
Yeah.
And I think as individuals, because we've not been able to spend very much money, a lot of people have been able to save a little bit. And I think they'll be wanting to spend that on holidays, buying new homes, decorating, and a whole range of other things that normally we would have been doing. So I'm very optimistic, to answer your question.
I think it's always horrific for any business that unfortunately struggled or went under during the COVID. But from from the ashes, normally a investment will come in once the demand is back.
Yeah, completely.
The hospitality industry will hopefully have a big boom again, as well as retail and, as say, travel, which has really struggled. So yeah, I'm optimistic for the year ahead. Myself, it's just a case of when. It's kind of when does these
It's a
things start
gradual
happening,
process, isn't it? I think we're not going to go to sleep on a Friday night and everything's still in lockdown as it is now, and then Monday wake up and the world is suddenly a brighter place. It's a transition. It'll be a gradual transition as we move through the year. But I think the back end of the year, last third of the year, I suspect is going to be very busy. An interesting point here is that that's also true of the employment market.
Yeah.
Once people start to feel safe or safer, they will start to think about changing jobs again. And we'll start to see a lot of movement in the labor market. There are, I think, a lot of people out there right now who are not necessarily happy in their jobs, but they have jobs, and that obviously is an important thing at the moment.
Security is
Security.
I think is really at the forefront of a lot of candidates' minds.
Absolutely. And I think when they start to feel more at ease with what's going on, and feel more comfortable with the world at large, there'll be movement in the labor market, and that, I think, is a warning for employers. Recognize that you need to work very, very hard at bonding with your employees, looking after them, taking care of them, making sure they're comfortable and they're happy. Because when the market changes, when the economy lifts, those people that feel aggrieved with the way they've been treated will leave. So, it's not too late.
Invest in learning and
Invest
development.
in your people.
Invest in the people.
Absolutely. Completely.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. It's been a really interesting chat. Have you got anything coming up, or anything that you wanted to plug at all? I know you do a lot of sort of webinars. Is there anywhere anyone can go and find your information or any of the stuff that you put out?
Thank you for the plug. Appreciate that, Matt. So I'm a co-founder and director of a company called Jump Advisory Group. We're a management consultancy. We work with a large range of businesses around the UK and globally. And you can find us on www.jumpadvisory.com. And you can find me on paul@jumpadvisory.com, my email address, or my mobile number 07960 550 756. Or you can just contact Hunter Bond, and I'm sure you guys would be pleased to put anybody in touch with me.
Will do. Thank you so much for your time, Paul. Speak to you soon.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Matt. Take care.